Some of the most composed people you will ever meet are not at peace, they are contained. There is a difference, and it matters more than most people realize. You probably know someone like this, Yaim. Or maybe you are someone like this. Someone who rarely raises their voice, who handles conflict with measured words and a steady expression, who, when things get hard, seems to just absorb it. Others often say they admire this. They call it maturity, patience, strength. But what if some of that stillness isn't strength at all? What if it's something older, something learned in a place where showing anger wasn't safe? And what was learned then is still quietly running the show. Anger doesn't vanish just because you were taught not to feel it. It finds another way. It always does. And in today's video, we're going to look at exactly what that looks like. 6 patterns that develop in people who were never allowed to be angry, and why they're not character flaws. They're maps. Maps of something that was never allowed to surface. Before we go further, if something in those first few words already landed in a familiar place, I'd love to know. Leave a comment, subscribe if you want to walk this territory more deeply, and tell me, which of these patterns felt uncomfortably familiar to you? I'll be reading. Now let's keep going. To understand why anger gets buried the way it does, we need to go back further than you might expect. Think about who you were at 5 or 8 or 12 years old. At that age, you were not choosing your emotional responses from a place of reflection. You were surviving, and part of that survival meant reading the room, learning with extraordinary precision which emotions were welcome and which ones made the people around you pull away, go cold, or erupt. In some households, anger was explicitly forbidden. You were told directly, don't raise your voice, don't be so dramatic, there's nothing to be angry about. You should be grateful. The message was clear. Your anger is too much. Your anger is a problem. In other environments, the prohibition was never spoken, it was demonstrated. A parent who went silent for days after any confrontation. A family where tension was always present but never named. A home where certain emotions were simply not visible, not acknowledged, not real. You learned by watching. Here, we don't do that. And in some cases, it wasn't just that anger was unwelcome, it was genuinely dangerous. Expressing frustration or defiance meant rejection, punishment, or the loss of connection with someone whose love you needed to survive. So you made a choice that wasn't really a choice. You let the anger go, or so it seemed. What actually happened is far more complex. When an emotion is consistently denied access to consciousness, especially during the years when we are forming a sense of who we are, it doesn't dissolve. It migrates. It becomes part of what Jung called the shadow, a part of the psyche that holds everything we've decided we cannot be. This is important to understand. The shadow isn't evil, it isn't weakness, it is simply the repository of everything that was exiled from your acceptable self. And anger, especially for those of us who were taught early that it was dangerous, shameful, or unlovable, is one of the most common residents. What you did, almost certainly without knowing it, was construct an identity that had no room for anger. I am the calm one. I am the peacekeeper. I am the one who holds it together. These aren't lies exactly, but they are incomplete, because somewhere behind that identity, the anger didn't go anywhere. It just changed form. Think of it this way. The psyche under these conditions is not unlike a pressure cooker, one where someone has sealed the release valve. The steam doesn't disappear. It builds. It finds the weakest points in the structure. It redistributes itself through every available crack. And if the pressure becomes great enough, something eventually gives way. That sealed valve is what we're really talking about. And the 6 patterns that follow are what happens to the steam. Jung suggested something that, when you really sit with it, is quietly unsettling. He proposed that what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves doesn't simply fade from the world, it finds its way back to us from the outside, wearing other faces. We project it, we attract it, we become it in ways we cannot see. The shadow, in his understanding, is not a place where things go to die, it is a place where things go to wait. And the longer they wait, the more organized they become, the more influence they accumulate, the more they shape choices, reactions, relationships, from beneath the surface of conscious awareness, not as chaos, but as pattern. That is precisely what we're going to look at now, not the explosion of anger you can recognize and name, but the architecture it builds when it is never allowed to surface. The first pattern is chronic niceness that feels heavy. There is a kind of kindness that comes from genuine warmth, a desire to contribute, to connect, to care for the people around you. And then there is a kind of niceness that comes from somewhere else entirely, You know the difference when you feel it, even if you've never named it. The niceness that feels heavy is the kind that leaves you exhausted after social interactions. It's the yes that came out of your mouth when your whole body wanted to say no. It's the smile held in place while something underneath was quietly screaming. People who were never allowed to be angry often develop people pleasing, not as a character trait but as a survival strategy, one that outlived its original purpose. In a household where your anger provoked withdrawal or punishment, making others comfortable was the safest available option. It kept the peace. It preserved the connection. It worked. The problem is that it keeps working long after the original threat is gone. The habit of chronic accommodation becomes so automatic that many people genuinely don't notice it happening until they're already drained, already resentful, already wondering why they feel so alone in a life full of people who seem pleased with them. This is people-pleasing in its clinical sense, not a virtue, but a defense. And the anger it conceals isn't petty. It's the accumulated weight of years of self-abandonment, of consistently choosing others' comfort over your own integrity. The tell is in the heaviness. Genuine generosity feels expansive. This kind feels like carrying something no one else can see. The second pattern is silent resentment. If the first pattern is about performing warmth you don't fully feel, the second is what that performance accumulates over time. Resentment is what happens to anger that is never expressed. It doesn't stay clean and accessible. It ferments, it spreads through the cracks of daily life, coloring interactions. With a faint but persistent sourness, making everything feel slightly more effortful, slightly less worth it. People with this pattern often describe a baseline sense of being unseen or taken advantage of without being able to point to a specific incident that caused it. Because it isn't a specific incident, it's 1,000 small moments where they swallowed what they actually felt and served something different in its place. The silencing isn't always conscious. It often happens faster than thought. Something irritating occurs. The resentment registers. And then, almost instantly, it's covered, redirected, converted into something more socially acceptable. A joke, a silence, a change of subject. What you call peace might actually be suppression wearing the right clothes. Silent resentment doesn't announce itself. It leaks. It shows up in the slightly too sharp comment delivered as sarcasm, in the subtle withdrawal when someone asks for something, in the deep fatigue that descends around people you love, but also, somewhere beneath that love, deeply resent. The third pattern is emotional numbness, when anger isn't the only emotion being suppressed, and it rarely is. The psyche sometimes arrives at a broader solution. Instead of selectively blocking one channel, it dims the whole system. Emotional numbness is not sadness, it is not depression, though it can look similar from the outside. It is more like a persistent flatness, a quality of moving through life at a slight remove from your own experience. Things happen, but they don't quite land. Moments that should feel significant somehow don't. Connection feels effortful, not because people aren't caring, but because something on your end isn't quite meeting them. This pattern often develops in people who learned, early and thoroughly, that strong emotions were unsafe, not just anger, all of it. Because once you start managing the internal landscape with that level of vigilance, the management itself becomes the baseline. The suppression becomes structural. And the cost of that structure is aliveness. The more you avoid anger, the more it shapes you from the shadows, so including by gradually dimming everything else adjacent to it. What's particularly disorienting about this pattern is that it can feel from the inside like nothing. Not like suffering, but like absence. And absence is much harder to bring to therapy, to relationships, to yourself, because it doesn't ache in ways that announce their own name. The fourth pattern is passive control. Here is where the shadow becomes strategic. People who cannot express anger directly often develop sophisticated indirect methods for getting their needs met, or for managing the anxiety that arises when those needs aren't met. This is passive control, and it operates below the level of conscious intention in most people who practice it. It might look like withholding, a deliberate silence when someone expects engagement, a small withdrawal of warmth that communicates displeasure without naming it. It might look like procrastination, specifically the kind that creates problems for someone else while maintaining complete deniability. I just forgot. I've been busy. I didn't mean to. Not expressing anger doesn't make it disappear, it makes it strategic. This is one of the patterns that tends to provoke the most discomfort when people recognize it in themselves, because it implicates them in something that feels less sympathetic than simple suppression. But it's crucial to understand where it comes from. This isn't manipulation born of selfishness. It's anger that was never given a legitimate channel, finding the only available exit routes. The shadow doesn't care about social approval, it just wants expression. And when the front door is permanently locked, it learns to use the windows. The fifth pattern is sudden emotional explosions. Everything we've explored so far describes systems designed to contain. But containment has limits. There is a concept in Jung's work that he called enantiodromia, the tendency of things, when pushed to an extreme, to transform into their opposite. He borrowed the word from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who observed that opposites generate each other, that excessive pressure in one direction eventually produces a violent movement in the other. In practical terms, the person who never gets angry does eventually get angry. And when it happens, it almost never looks proportional to what triggered it. A small thing becomes the final thing. A minor frustration cracks the surface that has been holding for years. What comes out is not just the emotion of the moment. It's everything that was never allowed out before this moment. If you were never allowed to be angry, where did that energy go? Here. It went here. These explosions leave people confused about themselves, and often more ashamed than ever. The episode becomes evidence for the story they've always told: I can't trust my own emotions, I'm unstable, it's better to keep it all locked down. And so the cycle tightens. More suppression, more pressure, another sealed valve. The explosion is not the problem, the explosion is the signal. It's the psyche insisting, in the only language loud enough to be heard, that something has been ignored for too long. The sixth pattern is self-directed anger. When anger cannot move outward, it often turns inward. This pattern may be the most quietly devastating of the six because it speaks in the first person and uses your own voice. It sounds like an inner critic that is never satisfied, like a baseline assumption that you are the problem, in the relationship that failed, in the opportunity you didn't take, in the version of your life that still hasn't materialized. Self-criticism, chronic guilt, a deep discomfort with your own needs. These are not virtues dressed as humility. They are anger that has nowhere else to go. So it settles into the architecture of your self-perception and begins to renovate from the inside. Jung understood that the shadow, when unexpressed, doesn't just project outward. It can also turn inward, becoming a kind of internal persecutor. Rigid, unforgiving, always finding evidence for whatever story it was trained to believe. And the story it was often trained to believe in people who were forbidden their anger is this: I am the one who should have done better. I am the one who needs to be managed. Some of your most persistent self-doubts may not be honest assessments. They may be anger wearing a very convincing disguise. Now, if you've recognized yourself in some of these patterns, more than one, maybe all of them, I want to say something before we go further. This is the territory where people tend to want a map and a clear destination, and I understand that impulse. When something like this clicks into place, when you see the architecture of something that has been shaping you, without your permission, so the natural response is to want to dismantle it immediately. There's something in the description below that I found genuinely useful for people who are ready to go beyond recognition and into something more structured. It won't do the work for you. Nothing will. But if you're feeling that pull to go deeper in a more deliberate way, it might be worth a look when this video ends. For now, let's go deeper into why these patterns persist. The question that often comes up at this point is a reasonable one. If these patterns are so costly, if they drain energy, create resentment, generate explosions, and slowly erode the sense of self, why don't people just stop? The answer is that the psyche is not primarily organized around what is healthy. It is organized around what is familiar, and more fundamentally, around what once kept us safe. The 6 patterns we've explored are not random dysfunctions. They are the logical outcome of a system that learned, in real time and under real stakes, that anger was dangerous. And the part of the psyche that learned this lesson did not lose its conviction just because the original danger passed. It adapted. It generalized. It applied the old lesson to new situations, new people, new environments, because that is what psychic defense mechanisms do. This is why insight alone is rarely sufficient. Understanding the pattern is not the same as integrating it. You can read every book ever written on the psychology of anger suppression, recognize yourself in every page, and still find yourself people-pleasing by Tuesday, carrying silent resentment by Wednesday, exploding by Friday. Because the work of integration isn't cognitive, it's something that happens in the body, in relationship, in the slow renegotiation of what safety actually means. Jung was precise about this. He didn't believe the shadow could be eliminated, and he was skeptical of the idea that simply knowing about one's shadow was enough to transform it. What he proposed instead was something more demanding and more profound: integration. The recognition and gradual acceptance of the exiled parts of the self, not as something to be cured, but as something to be known. You didn't lose your anger. You just lost permission to feel it. And reclaiming that permission is not a single moment. It is a direction. What does it actually mean to reclaim your anger? Let's be clear about what this isn't. It isn't about becoming more explosive, more confrontational, or less careful with others. The goal of integrating suppressed anger is not to dismantle your self-control. It is to transform the relationship between you and the emotion so that anger becomes information rather than threat, and expression becomes a choice rather than a compulsion or an impossibility. Healthy anger has a function. It marks violations of boundaries. It signals when something important is being disregarded. It carries energy that, when conscious and directed, becomes clarity, assertiveness, and the capacity to defend what you value. This is anger as a natural instrument of the self, not as something to be performed or suppressed, but as something to be listened to. Reclaiming this means, first, learning to recognize it before it transforms. Most people with the patterns we've explored can identify the explosion, the resentment, the numbness, but they've lost contact with the original signal, the moment early in an interaction or at a situation when something genuine registered, when a boundary was crossed, when something unfair happened and some quiet part of the self noticed. That noticing is what gets trained away. And rebuilding it requires patience, not willpower. It also requires something that can feel counterintuitive for people raised on the idea that their emotions are problems. Permission. Permission to feel irritated without it being a character failure. Permission to say this doesn't work for me without catastrophizing the relationship. Permission to take up space in the emotional field without constant negotiation. This is not easy. It will likely feel wrong at first, in the particular way that all genuine changes feel wrong. Not because it is, but because it's unfamiliar. Because it contradicts a story you've been living for a long time. But here is what I've observed in this work and in my own. When people begin to allow the anger its place at the table, the other patterns quietly begin to loosen. The people-pleasing becomes more selective. The resentment has less to feed on. The numbness starts to lift. The explosions become less necessary because the steam has somewhere to go. Before the final thought, if this has moved something in you, subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone you think might be walking this territory without a name for it. And when was the first time you remember feeling that your anger wasn't allowed? Leave it in the comments. You might find you're not as alone in that memory as you think. And if you're ready to take this somewhere more deliberate, the link in the description is there when you are. There's a question worth leaving with. Not one that asks you to reach a conclusion. Not one that offers a tidy resolution. Just a question that might stay with you as you move through the next day, the next conversation, the next moment, when you notice yourself reaching automatically for containment. If you were never allowed to be angry, who did you have to become?